Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you what we have learned about the returns to fungicide seed treatment in field peas seeded to fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot pressure. I'd like to begin by giving my sincere thanks to my staff, Aaron Faust, Suan Collis, Jesse Hafner, Gabby Henson, and our seasonal student workers. I'd like to give thanks to the funding agencies who have made this work possible: the Northern Pulse Growers Association, the North Dakota Department of Agriculture's Pesticide Harmonization and Registration Board, and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. I'd also give thanks to the private companies who do contract fungicide testing with us. It is the revenue from that testing that gives us the financial resources that we need to purchase and maintain the farm equipment to do this research. I'd like to briefly describe our methods. We conducted these studies on fields with a long history of field pea and or lentil production. These are fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot that built up naturally from a long history of growing the crop. We conducted the studies as randomized studies with 6 replicates. This means that you randomize the treatment 6 times and take the average across those 6 tests. We conducted these as planting date studies with the planting dates randomized. Every study had 3 or 4 different planting dates. Okay, what this allowed us to do is look at the response to fungicide seed treatment relative to soil temperature. Okay, we assess soil temperature by installing data logging soil temperature sensors at the 2-inch seeding depth concurrent with planting. These recorded soil temperature every 2 hours. Okay, and plot size was 5 foot by 30 foot at planting, about 5 foot by 20 foot at harvest. The shorter plot length at harvest was because we dug up plants to assess root rot in strips from the front and strips from the back of the plot, and then we shortened the plots to exclude the areas where we dug roots. This left about a 20-foot length in the center of every seeded length where we did not dig any roots and where we assessed yield. Okay, seeding rate was 330,000 viable seeds an acre. We assessed root rot at early to mid-vegetative growth. We assessed the percentage of plants exhibiting wilt symptoms associated with severe root rot at mid to late pod fill. We did everything we could to maintain those assessments at a consistent growth stage across planting dates and across field pea varieties, such that that every field pea variety, every planting date was assessed at the same growth stage. Now, we did pathogen diagnostic testing to confirm that Aphanomyces and Fusarium contribute to the observed root rot symptoms observed at early to mid-vegetative growth. Okay, in 2017 to 2020, this was done with a mixture of microbiological methods and DNA-based molecular diagnostic methods. In the testing conducted in 2023 and 2024, we only did DNA-based molecular diagnostic methods. Now, we did not do any testings for Pythium or Rhizoctonia. Okay, when we saw a response to fungicide seed treatment that you would typically expect from Pythium and Rhizoctonia, which means a stand establishment response where the seed treatment conferred better field pea plant establishment in very cool soils, we assumed that this was a response due to Pythium and Rhizoctonia. Likewise, when we saw a root rot response to seed treatment associated that occurred in peas grown in very cool soils, we assumed that this was due to primarily Rhizoctonia root rot, but this was not, but we did not ever test for Pythium or Rhizoctonia. Okay, I'd like to transition into results. Okay, first I'd like to talk about the response to seed treatment with the commercial seed treatment, fungicide seed treatment, Obvious from BASF. Now, what you can see here is that the results are organized by soil temperature. On the x-axis, you have the average soil temperature at seeding depth, at the 2-inch seeding depth, in the first 7 days after planting. Now, the reason why we utilize that is that gives you a very good snapshot of the average soil conditions to which the germinating seeds were exposed. Okay? And any given day, those soil temperatures can go up a bit or go down a bit based on the weather that day. If you look at the average over 7 days, this is average day and night over the first 7 days after planting, it really gives you a very good snapshot of the conditions. Okay, and it's not biased by any warm or cold weather on any given day. Okay, the other thing is that this is a metric anyone can utilize to make management decisions, i.e. to make decisions on when to plant. If you know what your current soil temperature is, day and night, at seeding depth, and you know the 10-day forecast, you can target a soil temperature within this range with really very good accuracy. Okay, so the bar graphs show the average yield conferred with non-treated seed versus treated seed in the particular studies where the seed treatment was evaluated. Okay, in every given range of soil temperature. And what you'll see right away is that the yields drop off sharply after 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, again, these studies were conducted in fields with a long history of Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot. Okay, as the soils warm up, the soils become more favorable for activity from Aphanomyces and Fusarium. Aphanomyces and Fusarium are warm soil pathogens, and so if your field peas are planted into very warm soils, Aphanomyces and Fusarium are active right away as those seeds are germinating. Okay, and on the contrary, if you plant your peas into really cool soils, the Aphanomyces and Fusarium are not very active yet, and the peas can get a running start. And so what you see is that your highest yields are achieved here when we plant into cooler soils. Now, I would caution you against getting too specific about the optimal soil temperature on the basis of this testing, because this is a relatively small sample size. I will present a different presentation looking at the responses to planting to soil temperature for optimizing planting date. But this gives you a rough idea. What you can see is that in the soils above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, we saw a sharp drop-off in yield potential. Okay, now, on the lower part, you see a scatter plot. You see these little circles. Every one of those circles is the response that we observed in one planting date in one study. And this is the yield gain conferred, or the loss, conferred by that fungicide seed treatment in that planting date of that study. And what you can see right away is that the yield gain is highest in early planted peas, i.e. in cold soils. And this makes lots of sense. It's in those cool, wet soils that Pythium and Rhizoctonia are most important. Now, these seed treatments have excellent efficacy against Pythium and Rhizoctonia, and so you plant the peas into cool, wet soils, and you use a fungicide seed treatment. The fungicide seed treatment takes care of much of your Pythium and Rhizoctonia problem, giving you a really big yield bump, okay? And now that yield bump tapers off as the soils get warmer, because Obvious is a very good product against Pythium and Rhizoctonia, but does not have a lot of efficacy against Fusarium. And so as the soils warm up and become really favorable for Fusarium, but become less favorable for Pythium and Rhizoctonia, you see, yes, less of a yield gain from the seed treatment with Obvious. Now, just a quick glance, and you'll see all of those studies. In all those studies, in soil temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, we consistently saw a yield gain from the fungicide seed treatment. You'll see every one of those circles is above the yellow, okay? And you're looking at an average yield gain of 3 to 5.6 bushels an acre from the fungicide seed treatment. Again, these are fields with native pathogen pressure. These were conducted at on-farm sites in Williams, Mountrail, and McLean counties in western North Dakota. These are long-term no-till locations, and also at the Carrington Research Extension Center in Foster County. In Carrington, these are either direct seeded or conventional tillage. Now, but what we found is that the results were consistent if you sorted them by soil temperature, okay? And so that's why these results are sorted by soil temperature. All right, a little bit more about the response to fungicide seed treatment with Obvious. you'll see that we saw an increase in field P establishment in soils below about 59 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit with the use of the seed treatment, and we saw a modest reduction in root rot severity in soils below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is what we'd expect when we have Pythium and Rhizoctonia pressure. Okay, this seed treatment is very good about managing those diseases, and this is the soil temperature range where you'd expect those diseases to be most severe. Okay, and thus what you should conclude is that the activity of Avius is most likely due to management of Pythium and Rhizoctonia. Now, we tested another fungicide seed treatment. This was a mixture we created ourselves, Extend C, which is a product from Bayer that has very good activity against Rhizoctonia. Proline, this is actually the foliar Proline product, and it's legally permissible for use on peas at the rates specified here, but it's a very good fusarium product. Okay, Allegiance, which is metalaxyl, which is a good Pythium product. Okay, so we mix these three, but what you notice here, now we have a very good fusarium product in the mix, not just a good Rhizoctonia and Pythium product. Okay, and what you can see here is that the yield gain conferred by the fungicide seed treatment is relatively stable across soil temperature. So as those soils warm up and become less favorable for Pythium and Rhizoctonia and more favorable for fusarium, the seed treatment is basically holding its own and still conferring this a roughly equivalent yield gain of in that 3 to 5 bushel range. Okay, and that's because as the soils warm and become favorable for the fusarium, the seed treatment is able to have activity against that fusarium and still give you a pretty decent gain. But now let's look at those average yields in that bar graph. And what do you see? The same thing we saw before, a sharp drop-off in yield potential as you get above 55 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperatures. Okay, and basically, having a seed treatment with efficacy against fusarium certainly helps you as you get into those warm soils. But you can see that it's not enough to offset the loss in yield potential associated with planting into warm soils. Okay, and so really, if you're planting into these soils with elevated Aphanomyces and fusarium pressure, you need to plant when the soils are relatively cool in order to give the peas a running start against this root rot complex. The seed treatment can give you excellent efficacy against the Pythium and Rhizoctonia that you might see planting that early, but it's not going to do enough against the fusarium, and it's not going to do anything against the Aphanomyces. And so you really need to plant when it's cool and give the peas a running start, okay? And because planting later, the seed treatment can't make up for that delayed planting. Let's talk a little bit more about what type of response we saw to this mixture of products applied in a mix as a seed treatment on peas. What you can see is, again, once we had activity against fusarium, we saw a consistent modest bump in field P establishment irrespective of soil temperature. Okay, so as the soils became less favorable for Pythium and Rhizoctonia and more favorable for fusarium, the seed treatment still helped us with establishment. Okay, and for root rot severity, we saw again the greatest reduction in root rot severity in the really cool soils where conditions were most favorable for Rhizoctonia. Not surprising, because again, the seed treatment is going to have the best efficacy against Rhizoctonia root rot versus fusarium in terms of making a visual reduction in root rot severity. Okay, we also looked in these studies at the impact of adding ethoboxam to a standard fungicide seed treatment. Okay, so ethoboxam, which we tested under the product name Intego Solo. Now, this is also marketed under different product names, especially now. I don't know if Intego is still in the market, but ethoboxam definitely is. Now, Intego Solo was labeled at 0.2 to 0.4 fluid ounces per hundredweight. We tested at the intermediate rate of 0.3 fluid ounces, okay? And you don't want to apply above 0.4 because it's known to be a bit phytotoxic above 0.4 fluid ounces per hundredweight. Okay, so we tested this as an addition to either obvious or Evergoal energy. And so the data you'll see here is a base seed treatment. This is either Evergoal energy or obvious versus that base seed treatment plus Intego Solo plus ethoboxam. Okay, so we want to know, is it worth it to add a product to our standard seed treatment because that product is known to have some efficacy against the Phantomyces? Okay, that's what we want to know here. And what you can see here is, in terms of the yield response, is that we're seeing a gain in yield in the field piece from adding the ethoboxam when soils get above 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 7 days after planting. But we're not seeing a gain in yield before then. Okay, so ethoboxam also has efficacy against Pythium. Okay, so if you have a field where you have metalaxyl resistance or mefenoxam resistance, well then adding ethoboxam to the seed treatment is likely to help you in those really cold soils. In the fields where we did this testing, we did not have problems with metalaxyl resistance. Okay, so the ethoboxam was just helping us with Phantomyces. Given that understanding, now we understand why we only saw a yield gain in warm soils, because the Phantomyces isn't active enough at the seedling stage when the seed treatment can help, okay, in cold soils. All right, so once the soils got warmer, then the ethoboxam helped us with yield. But let's look at the average yields in that bar graph. What do you see? You can see that adding the ethoboxam helped maintain our yield potential in 50 to 59 degree soils. But it did not allow us to exceed the yield potential we obtained without ethoboxam by planting in optimal soils between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit at the seeding depth in the first 7 days after planting. Okay, so essentially ethoboxam is a tool for helping mitigate losses to Phantomyces if you end up having to plant a little bit too late. But it is not something that will actually give you enough of a gain to compensate for late planting. Really, you want to be planting at the optimal soil temperature, because a seed treatment, just like that Fusarium seed treatment we discussed a few minutes ago, the seed treatment's not enough to make, it does not have enough efficacy to make up for planting under suboptimal conditions. Okay. So what did we see in terms of a response? What you saw is that if you look at field B emergence, this is really interesting. Under really cold soils, we saw a little bit of a gain from the seed treatment in terms of emergence, and really, really warm soils, we saw a little bit of gain. Well, these are the soil temperatures where you'd expect some seed decay and early seedling death due to Pythium in very cold soils or Phantomyces in very warm soils. Okay, and seed treatment with ethoboxam, as you would expect, would reduce that death and increase your plant population. Okay, in the intermediate soil temperatures, you actually saw a reduction in field P establishment with the use of ethoboxam. Now, why do you see that? What did I say when we started this discussion about ethoboxam? I said that it is slightly phytotoxic at an application rate above 0.4 fluid ounces per hundredweight, applied as Intego Solo. Okay. Well, what we're seeing here is that it is apparently just a little bit phytotoxic even at the lower application rate too. Because if the Pythium and Phantomyces pressure is not high enough is not high enough, like in those intermediate soil temperatures, you actually see that phytotox. Okay, at the other soil temperatures, the phytotox is happening too, but what's happening is that the gains in terms of disease control offset the phytotox. But when the soil temperatures are not quite as favorable for the Pythium and Phantomyces, then the impact of the phytotox shines through, because the disease control is not enough to offset the losses. Okay, so anyway, that's what that smiley face is in the the scatter plot on field P establishment. And it's not a smile, it's really a frown, because ideally that would not drop below 0. Okay. All right, very good. Average root rot response. We didn't see much of a response in terms of root rot severity with the use of this product, and that's not terribly surprising. Aphanomyces is very aggressive, okay, and it's going to be very difficult to pick that up visually, okay, and it goes back to my point that what we've really been seeing in terms of response to C treatments up to this point for root rot severity is most likely rhizoctonia, reductions in rhizoctonia, and of course ethoboxam will do nothing against rhizoctonia. Okay, now the question I always got as I was presenting these results, and again I'm presenting right now the results from our early testing from 2017 to 2020. Okay, the testing question I always got was, well, can I see the same response to fungicide C treatment in fields that don't have elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot, in fields that don't have a super long history of growing peas or peas and lentils? And we didn't address that question quite as directly as I would have liked, but we did assess it partially. Okay, so in 2018 and 2019 primarily, but also a little bit in 2020, we tested in fields without a long history of field P or lentil production. We tested Evergol Energy, a seed treatment from Bayer, against allegiance. Okay, unfortunately we did not test this against naked seed. Okay, but what you have here is that, and we did the same testing in fields with elevated root rot pressure due to elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure due to a long history of growing peas or peas and lentils. Okay, and so the testing done in fields without a long history of peas and lentils were done in Carrington and Williston on fields that we knew didn't have, you know, any Aphanomyces or Fusarium problems. Okay, and the other studies with a long history of peas and lentils, this was done at on-farm sites in McLean, Mountrail, Williams County, as well as in Carrington. Okay, and all these data are a mixture of no-till and conventional till, and again the results sorted very well if you sorted them by soil temperature. Okay, and again that's the soil temperature at seeding depth in the first 7 days after planting, average day and night. Okay, so what are we looking at when you're looking at Evergol Energy versus Allegiance? Well, both of these products contain metalaxyl. Okay, so both of these products have activity against Pythium, but they differ because Evergol Energy also has active ingredients that have activity against Fusarium and Rhizoctonia. The penflufen is an excellent Rhizoctonia product. The prothioconazole, as we've already discussed, is a good Fusarium product. And so essentially you're looking at what's the impact of using a seed treatment with efficacy against Rhizoctonia and Fusarium in these fields with elevated root rot pressure versus not. Okay, and so elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure versus not. And so in the fields that did not have a long history of growing field peas, you can look at our end of season wilt data, so the percent of plants that exhibited wilt symptoms associated with severe root rot, and you can see that, I mean, the root rot severe, I mean, there was not much wilt, and that's what you'd expect. There wasn't a long history of growing peas or lentils. There wasn't elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot, so thus you don't have a whole lot of wilted plants. And you can see that the fungicide seed treatment obviously didn't do much for the wilt symptoms because there just wasn't much wilt. Okay. Now, in the studies with a long history of pea and lentil production and with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium, obviously now you're going to see much more wilt. And what you can see is that even at those relatively cool soil temperatures, 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, we have unacceptable levels of wilt. You can see with the lesions alone, you had almost 12% incidence of wilt symptoms at mid to late pod film. Okay, and now our fungicide seed treatment seems to be helping us some. Okay, again, remember that the Evergol Energy has active ingredient with activity against Fusarium. Okay, And it's not a statistically significant reduction, but you can see it's helping us. Now, the wilt levels would have been much higher had we gone into warmer soils, north of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and but those studies, just because the nature of the years in which we conducted them, we didn't have the really warm soils. Okay. All right, now what about the yield? Okay, so what you saw in the studies without a long history of field pea and lentil production and without elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium, you saw a negligible response to having a fungicide seed treatment active ingredients with activity against Fusarium and Rhizoctonia. Okay, it's positive until you get to the very warm soils where Rhizoctonia is less active, okay, but not by much. Okay, half a bushel to maximum about 0.9 bushels average. Okay, and obviously our total gain from fungicide seed treatment would be higher because we presumably had some degree of Pythium pressure here. Okay, and I wish this testing would have been done against naked seed, but it wasn't. So our total gain would have been higher. But what this basically shows is that the use of an active ingredient targeting Rhizoctonia and Fusarium gave us a very modest yield gain in fields that did not have a long history of pea and lentil production. Okay, and on the other hand, in the fields where we did have a long history of pea and lentil production, we saw a very strong response to adding these active ingredients. Okay, and we saw this even in really cold soils where Fusarium is not very active. Okay, we did not do pathogen diagnostic testing for Rhizoctonia, but this bears the hallmark of Rhizoctonia also being at elevated levels in these fields with Aphanomyces and Fusarium. Okay, and we just wouldn't expect this type of response to a fungicide seed treatment in really cold soils unless Rhizoctonia were present. Okay. And so, again, the total yield gain conferred by the fungicide would be higher had we compared this against non-treated seed. All of our testing was obvious, and with that mixture of Xtend C plus Proline plus Allegiance, that testing was done against naked seed. Okay, and so there we're quantifying the response to Pythium as well. This study, we're not quantifying the response to Pythium because both of our products have Pythium activity. Okay, and so again, you would expect a higher yield response to fungicide seed treatment in the fields without Pythium, without a long history of field pea production or lentil production, if you were comparing this against naked seed. Okay, how much of a response, I don't know exactly, but more than we're seeing here. Okay, but what this does show is that these fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure do appear to respond to fungicide seed treatment much more. Fungicide seed treatment with activity against Rhizoctonia and Fusarium much more than the fields that don't have a long history. Okay, that's what this shows. All right, very good. That was our initial testing with fungicide seed treatments. Okay, we did more testing in the last 2 years and much more rigorous testing. Okay, but what I want to share with you is what we learned in those first years before we follow this up with more testing here in 2023 and 2024. Okay, first off, what we learned is that fungicide seed treatment is most likely to confer strong yield gains in fields with a long history of pea or lentil production. Okay. Second, in those fields with a long history of pea and lentil production and elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure, we saw yield gains very consistently of 3 to 5 bushels when planting with a fungicide seed treatment from a fungicide seed treatment when planting into cold soils, with soils where the average soil temperature was below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, average day and night in the first 7 days after planting, and we saw very similar yield gain in that 50 to 55 degree soil range. Okay, and what these results suggest is that these fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium also have elevated Pythium and or Rhizoctonia. Again, we did not do diagnostic testing targeting Pythium Rhizoctonia, but in those really cold soils, you just wouldn't expect the Aphanomyces and Fusarium to be active enough at the seedling stage of the peas to see this type of response. And we know that these fungicide seed treatments are excellent against Pythium and Rhizoctonia and marginal against Fusarium, and then the one product with activity against Aphanomyces, which is ethoboxam, is also just a moderate help, but only in the warmer soils. Okay, so this has all the hallmarks that these fields have elevated Pythium and Rhizoctonia pressure in addition to Aphanomyces and Fusarium. Okay, and then the next thing is that in these fields with elevated Fusarium and Aphanomyces, early planting was more effective than using than adding a fungicide seed treatment active ingredient with activity against Fusarium and Aphanomyces. Okay, so basically those active ingredients with activity against Fusarium and Aphanomyces can help you when you're planting into warm soils, but they do not do enough to offset the losses in yield potential associated with planting into warm soils. Okay, again, Aphanomyces and Fusarium are favored by warm soil temperatures, and they're much more active at the seedling stages of the peas when those peas are grown in warm soils than cold soils. If you plant into the cold soils, you give the peas a running start where they can get established with minimal root rot pressure, and then they only have to deal with the root rot as they get bigger. Okay, and that really helps your yield potential. Okay, we followed this up with testing conducted in 2023 and 2024 in Carrington. We did this testing across 11 fields in Carrington, differing in Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot pressure from very modest, very low levels of pressure to extreme levels of pressure. Essentially, 8 of the 11 fields had high to very high Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure. One field had moderate levels, what I consider moderate levels of pressure, and 2 fields had relatively low levels of Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure. And these are fields that differed in the crop rotation interval since the last time peas or lentils were grown, and differed in the number of times that peas or lentils have been grown on the field. And these fields were primarily had a history of peas, not so much lentils. Okay, we grow peas out here for foundation seed increase, and these were fields utilized by the foundation seed program. Okay, and so we did 4 planting dates between April 23rd and June 13th. Okay, and that April 23rd to 24th planting date went in when the soil temperatures were cool, average soil temperature of 43 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit in the 7 days after planting at seeding depth. Okay, and then by the time we got into May 10th to 12th, our soils were a lot warmer. Okay, and everything was north of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, again, these were studies where we direct seeded into last year's crop residues, or they were conventionally tilled. Okay, under these scenarios, the soils warm up quite quickly. Okay, so what did we see here? Okay, the use of obvious versus naked seed gave us a modest reduction in root rot severity. Okay, and every one of those dots in the scatter plot, again, is the result from one planting date in one study. The bar graphs would be the average result observed across all planting dates and all studies within that soil temperature range. What you can see is that there are tons of dots here because, again, 11 studies, 4 planting dates. Okay, those are 44 different assessments. One of those studies we did lose 1 planting date, so I guess 43 different assessments. Okay, and all given in 1 year. Okay, now let's look at wilt. Okay, and what you see is that at mid to late pod fill, the use of the fungicide seed treatment conferred a reduction in the overall incidence of wilted plants. Okay, and this would presumably be because of some degree of assistance against Fusarium root rot. Okay, but what you can see is that that reduction was only seen when we planted into relatively cool soils. When we planted into warm soils, okay, so soils north of 61, so north of 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, what you saw is that there was no reduction in wilt. Okay, the root rot was so bad the soils were so warm at planting, and the Phantomycin and Fusarium got established at such high severity early on that the seed treatment didn't help you. Okay, and then yield. What do you see here? In this case, what we saw is a 2 to 2.6 bushel average yield gain from the fungicide seed treatment when planting into cool to moderately warm soils, i.e. soil temperatures less than 61 degrees Fahrenheit in the 7 days after planting. This is roughly consistent with what we've observed earlier, in our earlier testing. And the other thing is that's very consistent, as you can see, is that you need it to be in those cool soils. Okay, in this case, less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, soil temperature, average day and night in the 7 days after planting to get your maximum yield potential. Planting into those warmer soils sharply reduced field pea yield potential, and the fungicide seed treatment helped you, but did not do enough to make up for the reduction in yield potential associated with planting into warm soils. Okay. The only difference here is that the yield gain in those really cold soils is, 2.6 bushels. That's in the range of what we saw before, but on the lower end, okay? But still certainly consistent with what we observed in 2017 to 2020. Now, in 2024, we also conducted testing with other fungicide seed treatments on different field pea varieties. Okay, and I discussed the response to variety selection in a different presentation. I'm not going to get into that here. But here you see one of those studies. This was a study that was just 2 years out of peas, so a 3-year rotation, extremely high root rot severity. And what you can see right away is that we tested fungicide seed treatment across 6 different field pea varieties and 4 different planting dates. And you can see that especially in early planting, we saw a very consistent yield gain to every one of these fungicide seed treatments, irrespective of variety. In the later planting dates, there seemed to be a differential response, where we were seeing a better response out of Vibrance Total than Obvious. But look at those yields. Who cares? The yield potential is extremely low because the soils are way too warm to be planting field peas into a field with this level of Phantomycin and Fusarium pressure. Okay, and so really what we're chasing is the yield gain that we can get from the fungicide seed treatment associated with planting early. Okay, we did the same testing on another field. Okay, overall root rot pressure, if you look at the percent of wilted plants, is a bit lower in this field because we had a better crop rotation interval. In this case, the last time we grown peas was 2015, and so we were 8 years out of peas. It was a 9-year rotation. Okay, so crop rotation interval certainly helped reduce our overall root rot pressure, even if it wasn't, a standalone measure that on its own was sufficient. It certainly helped. Okay. But at any rate, what you can see is the same thing we saw before, that very consistent responses to fungicide seed treatment in those early planted peas. As you got to the later planted peas, especially the less tolerant varieties, you can see that Vibrance Total seemed to work better than Obvious, but yield potential was so low that really the take-home is you don't want to plant into soils that warm in fields with elevated Phantomycin and Fusarium pressure, okay? And the seed treatment's not going to make up for it, okay? So let's look in greater detail at the comparative efficacy of these seed treatments. Now, these are the exact same data from those last 2 slides, just presented in a different format, okay? And so on the very top, you'll see the average response to the seed treatment in terms of incidence of wilt symptoms at mid to late pod fill, okay? And that's organized by soil temperature. Okay, so that's the average response across all the field pea varieties assessed and all the planting dates that fell within that soil temperature range across those 2 fields. Okay, and what you can see right now, I'm going to compare Obvious versus Obvious plus Rellenia. Now, Obvious, as we've discussed before, has excellent efficacy against Pythium rhizoctonia and only moderate efficacy against Fusarium. Okay, now Rolenia is a product sold by BASF that's specifically marketed for fusarium management, and we applied at the high end of the labeled rate, okay, 0.4 fluid ounces per hundredweight. And so what this is showing is the impact of adding Rolenia, okay, which is supposed to help us with our fusarium, okay. And what you can see right away is that it didn't perform as we would have hoped in this case. The reduction in wilt symptoms conferred by the fungicide seed treatment was actually higher for Obvious than it was for Obvious plus Rolenia. Now, if I were to make a guess, I would say, and this was consistent across all of the soil temperatures, okay? Now, if I were to make a guess, I would say, well, we probably would have had better results testing the Rolenia at a lower rate. Okay, probably 0.2 fluid ounces would have been a better choice, but I don't know. That's just a guess. Okay, now, and now if you look at the comparative performance of Obvious and Rolenia versus Vibrance and Vibrance Total, you see that Obvious, at any rate, is performing very similar to Vibrance in terms of reduction in wilt symptoms. You look at the bar graph in those very cool soils. As the soils begin to warm up, Obvious is not as effective at reducing those wilt symptoms than the Vibrance Total. Okay. So let's look at yield potential. Okay. Right away, what you can see is that seed treatments, while they help you, are not enough to compensate for the reduction in yield potential associated with planting late. Okay, our best yields occurred when we planted when soil temperatures were below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, average day and night in the first 7 days after planting. Okay, and notice they're not super cold. We're at about 45, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Planting at 39 degree soils is not a good idea either. Okay, you can plant too early. But our best yields occurred then, and no fungicide seed treatment is going to make up for planting late. The fungicide seed treatments will help you in those late planted peas, but they cannot give you enough of a gain to compensate for the reduction in yield potential associated with planting late. Okay, and so what you can see right away here, and now look at Obvious alone. The yield gain conferred by the fungicide seed treatment relative to soil temperature, this is exactly what we saw, in our testing in 2017 to 2020. Notice we have a yield gain of almost 6 bushels an acre in the really cold soils. That yield gain comes down to about 3 bushels an acre in those moderate soil temperatures and tapers down to about 0 as you get to the really warm soils. Now look at the effect of adding Rolenia. Those yields are consistently lower. It doesn't matter the soil temperature. So adding the Rolenia, at least at 0.4 fluid ounces per hundredweight, did not help us. Okay, it just did not improve the performance of Obvious. If anything, it made it worse. Okay. You look at comparative yields in the bar graphs of Obvious versus Vibrance Total, and there is certainly a trend that's quite consistent of the Vibrance Total yielding higher. Okay, but in the very cold soils, you can see that really any of these seed treatments work really well for you. Certainly, there was no need to add Rolenia to Obvious. But really, any of these seed treatments work well for you in the really cold soils. And when you got to the really warm soils where you see that strongest trend with Vibrance Total performing a bit better, who cares? I mean, your potential is 11 to 15 bushels an acre. Basically, the take home is if you got Phanomyces and Fusarium pressure and you can't plant early, don't plant peas. Plant something else that year, okay? And because investing in the seed treatment to boost your yields from 11 to 13 bushels an acre, it's not worth it. All right, very good. So now we're going to look at Vibrance Total versus Vibrance Total plus Trebuchet, okay? Now, Trebuchet is Syngento's Rolenia. So this is a fusarium-specific product that you can add to your base seed treatment for additional activity against fusarium. So when you're planting in really cold soils, what you can see is that the addition of Trebuchet gave us a bit of a bump in terms of improved management of wilt, but it was very, very slight. The real gains to reducing wilt symptoms with trebuchet came in the warmer soils, especially those intermediate soil temperatures. You actually see a statistically significant reduction in end-of-season wilt symptoms with the trebuchet as you get into soils above 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the 7 days after planting. Okay, so this product is clearly improving on the performance of Vibrance Total when you're planting in the warm soils. When you're planting in the cold soils, it's not doing much for you. Okay, but when you're planting in the warm soils, it certainly helps. Okay, and that translates into the yield data. You see that in those warmer soils, that addition of trebuchet increased your yield gain conferred by the fungicide. In the really cold soils, it didn't help you. Okay, and that's what you'd expect. The fusarium is not very active in those very cold soils at the seedling stages when these seed treatments do something, and so you wouldn't expect that the addition of the fusarium products to help you in the cold soils. Now, okay, so adding the fusarium product gave you additional yield gain, or at least a trend therein, a very consistent trend of higher yields, okay, in those warmer soils. But look at these yields. It's just nowhere near enough to compensate for the reduction in yield potential associated with planting late. Okay, so really you're better off saving your money, just using that base seed treatment, in this case the Vibrance Total, and planting early. And likewise with Obvious. You use the Obvious, you save your money on the Rolania, don't bother with it. Just make sure you plant early. Okay, and same thing with the Vibrance Total. Just plant early if you know you have a Phantomyces fusarium pressure. And again, when I say early, you're targeting 43 to 49, 50 degree Fahrenheit soil temperatures in that 7 days after planting at seeding depth. You don't want to be planting in 38 or 39 degree soil temperatures. That's too cold, okay, and yields also suffer when you plant that early, okay. So we're talking early, but not too early, okay. Pay attention to the soil temperatures. All right, so we also did testing of Obvious in 2023, and we saw something very interesting. Now, 2023 was a very difficult year. It was extremely cold and wet early, like extremely cold and wet. And we couldn't plant any of our root rot studies until the earliest planting date was May 22nd, okay, after the crop insurance deadline. That was the earliest we could get in. It was just so wet. And then once we were able to get in the field, then suddenly it got really hot and it got quite dry. And we had plenty of soil moisture for the entirety of all of our planting date studies, of all our planting dates here, to be able to get the peas established and quickly emerge. But it got really hot. I mean, we had daytime highs in the 90s to almost 100 degrees for several weeks, okay, in late May into early June. And again, we're planting direct seeded or conventional tillage. 7 of these studies were direct seeded, 4 were conventional tillage. Soils warm up quite quickly under those conditions, and it was really hot. Now look at the average soil temperature in the 7 days after planting. Okay, I mean, we're looking at soil temperatures from 69 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit at seeding depth in the first 7 days after planting. This is unbelievable. And so what you're seeing, we did see a reduction in root rot severity. Again, Obvious has some degree of efficacy against fusarium, and you'd expect that under these conditions, okay? And that was consistent irrespective of soil temperature. But look what happened to the wilt. We consistently saw an increase in wilted plants in the peas that received the fungicide seed treatment, and that increase in wilt increased with soil temperature. Okay, again, these are extremely warm soils. I don't think you'll probably ever encounter in a long-term no-till type field within the range of planting dates that you would consider, okay? But under these very warm soils, and this is the only time we've had a chance to test this because it's very rare even under conventional till to get these types of soil temperatures within the range of dates that we'd even remotely consider planting peas. Okay, but within the range of these soil temperatures, what we saw is an increase in wilt associated with the fungicide seed treatment. So what this suggests is that there is some sort of something else going on, potentially activity against a natural antagonist of Aphanomyces. I don't know. But basically, the fungicide seed treatment was making the incidence of wilt worse in the really warm soils. And that translated into yield. Okay, and basically the fungicide seed treatment in this case was giving us a yield loss in the really warm soils, and that yield loss got worse as the soil temperatures got warmer. Now, we haven't evaluated soil temperatures quite this warm in any other study. Okay, the warmest we got in any other study was 69 point something. But if you remember the data I shared before, the yield gain conferred by obvious always trended to zero as we got to about 69 degrees soil temperatures. Okay, this is showing what's going on after we get above 69 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperatures. And we haven't had a chance to repeat it. I'm not confident in these results until I've seen it again, but it's certainly a cautionary note. All right, and the other thing I would mention is that we haven't tested any other soil seed treatment under these really warm soil temperatures. So really the take home here is that fungicide seed treatment is an excellent tool for increasing field pea yields in these fields with Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure when you're planting early. Okay, and planting early is an excellent tool for mitigating Aphanomyces and Fusarium damage in these fields. But it comes with it the increased risk of Pythium rhizoctonia. Planting early does. And the fungicide seed treatment is an excellent tool to complement that early planting. And it will reliably help you, and it doesn't really matter what product you use when you're planting early. Okay, so really this is a tool to help you plant early. Okay, and increase your yields and your field pea establishment, reduce your root rot in those early planted peas. Okay, fungicide seed treatment should not be looked at as a tool for managing Aphanomyces or Fusarium. Even the Fusarium products or the Aphanomyces product, ethoboxam, even though they have clearly some activity against Fusarium, and our data have shown that, that activity is not enough to offset the loss in yield potential associated with planting late. And when you're planting into really warm soils, just forget it. I mean, if you can't if you have a field with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot, what these data show is that you should only plant that field of peas if you can get in there early. The fungicide seed treatment is not going to save you and mitigate the loss of yield potential sufficiently. So that comes when you plant late into warmer soils in these fields. Okay, so again, the take home is that you want to use the fungicide seed treatment as a tool to facilitate early planting. Okay, the early planting that helps you. Now, in 2023 and 2024, we finally did test the impact of fungicide seed treatment versus naked seed. Okay, in fields with very little Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot pressure. And these are fields conducted under long-term no-till in Williston, at the Williston Research Center. This is a drier site, okay, which certainly helps keep the root rot, the Aphanomyces pressure lower, okay. But what you can see here is that these are the results across 2 field pea varieties and 2 years. Okay, and this is the root rot severity relative to the planting, the soil temperature in the first 7 days after planting. You can see a really wide range in planting dates because everything's contingent on just how thick the residues were in that no-till field and just how warm or cool it was that year. Okay, and at any rate, what you can see right away is that the use of the fungicide seed treatment always reduced your root rot, always. But the root rot severity was extremely low levels. Okay, you're reducing root rot severity from 3% down to 1 or 1.5%. I mean, these are really very, very low, almost negligible levels of root rot severity. What about yield? What you can see right away here is that it had no impact on yield. If anything, we saw a very, very slight trend that was negative, but I don't think that's real. Okay, essentially, this is as close to a zero response as you can expect to see. Okay, so what does this say? Obviously, you want to be targeting fungicide seed treatments in those fields where you know you have root rot pressure. Okay, again, what I've been talking about this entire time is response to fungicide seed treatment in fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure. The dogma has always been, well, seed treatments don't help you. What we have found is that seed treatments are a very valuable tool in these fields because in these fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure, you need to plant relatively early when the soil temperatures average target 43 to 49, 50 degrees Fahrenheit at seeding depth in the first 7 days after planting. When you plant that early, Pythium and Rhizoctonia are more active. The fungicide seed treatments have excellent activity against those diseases. And they will help you plant early. The seed treatments will. Okay? And really, the seed treatment is a tool for helping you get into those fields with elevated root rot pressure and get into them early and maximize your yield potential planted early. In the fields that do not have elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium pressure and that do not have a long history of growing peas and lentils, you can expect a more moderate response to the fungicide seed treatment. How much? I haven't tested across enough locations to know for sure. But certainly the data from Williston, the data that I presented from 2017 to 2020 with Evergo Energy versus Allegiance certainly indicates that the response to fungicide seed treatment is going to be lower in the fields that do not have a long history of pea and lentil production. Okay, so take-home messages. In these fields with a long history of pea and lentil production, what you can expect based on our research is a yield gain of 3 to 7 bushels an acre from a fungicide seed treatment when planting into cool soils. Okay, and we saw this response really with any soil temperature below 60 degrees Fahrenheit and with the highest gains seen below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. All right. Again, to maximize your yield potential, you really need to be in that 43 to 50 degrees soil temperature. I'll discuss that in a separate presentation on optimizing planting date. Okay, but that's the rule of thumb. Okay, in these fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium, early planting was more effective than spending the money to add an additional seed treatment active ingredient with activity against Aphanomyces or Fusarium. Okay, Vibrance Total and Obvious perform very similarly when planted into cold soils. As you got into warmer soils, the Vibrance Total performed better. But again, really the take home here is that in these fields with elevated Aphanomyces and Fusarium, you need to plant in the colder soils. Okay, and it doesn't matter what fungicide seed treatment you're using, you're not going to mitigate with the fungicide seed treatment, mitigate the yield loss associated with planting late sufficiently. Okay, so the seed treatment helps you, and certain seed treatments are a bit better than others in those warmer soils. Vibrance Total certainly perform better under warm soils than Obvious, but no fungicide seed treatments is going to fully offset the loss in yield potential associated with planting into warm soils, okay, and under these root rot conditions, okay. And the Fusarium product Trebucet performed better than Ralenia at the application rates that we tested, which were the high ends of that application rate, okay. But again, I don't know the wisdom of utilizing those products. You're better off just using a product targeting Pythium Rhizoctonia, saving yourself the money, and planting early when the soil temperatures are cool. Next thing is that the deleterious impact of Obvious that we saw on wilt and yield in 2023, planting in extremely warm soils, is something that you might see with other fungicide seed treatments too. I don't know. That's the only fungicide seed treatment we tested in those studies, unfortunately. And so I don't know if that's unique to obvious or not. Another thing is, remember, we've only seen that in 1 year. Okay, I haven't had a chance to test the impact of planting peas into soils that warm any other year. Okay, so the replicability of those results, I'm not sure of. But it's certainly another cautionary note that seed treatment is not going to be a tool for offsetting the deleterious impact of planting into really warm soils where you have a Phantomyces of fusarium pressure. Okay. The next thing I'll mention is that these are preliminary studies from conclusion. These are preliminary conclusions from research that is still in progress. Thank you very much for your time. If you have questions, reach out to me anytime. And thank you to my staff who are very dedicated to help with this. Thank you to Edson and Audrey who helped me with the studies conducted in Williston. Audrey is now working at another institution, but Edson has continued the research there. I've been very grateful for their help. I remind you that this research is funded by your checkoff dollars and by grant programs administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. And without their funding support, none of this would be possible. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.